Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of resilience and triumph. Today's story takes us to Meadow Creek, a quiet town that faced years of intimidation from a ruthless biker gang. But when Emma Blake, a nurse and former combat medic, refused to back down, she inspired an entire community to stand together. It's a story of courage, unity, and the strength found in facing fear head-on. Join us as we uncover how one woman's bravery transformed not just a town, but the hearts of those within it. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. It was a quiet, late evening when Emma Blake first walked into Red's Diner after a grueling 16-hour shift at St. Mary's Hospital. Nestled on the outskirts of Meadow Creek, Kansas, the diner had always been a refuge for night owls, long-haul truckers, hospital staff, and the occasional lone traveler. The soft hum of fluorescent lights and the warm scent of coffee gave the place a sense of comfort. But that evening, there was an edge of exhaustion in Emma's step. Emma, dressed in her blue scrubs, sat at the counter, her dark hair tied loosely back. Her eyes were tired but alert, reflecting a determination that ran deep. As a decorated combat medic who had served 3 tours in Iraq, she carried a quiet strength that belied her delicate frame. But tonight, she wasn't thinking about her past. She was simply trying to decompress after a particularly intense shift in the trauma unit. Nursing a cup of chamomile tea as she let the warmth ease the tension in her hands. Long day? The familiar voice of her best friend, Rachel Pierce, interrupted her thoughts. Rachel, a fellow nurse, slid onto the stool next to Emma with a sympathetic smile. Her own blonde hair was pulled into a neat ponytail, and her bright eyes showed concern. Emma nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. You could say that. That car accident kid earlier, it was close. Rachel sighed. You caught that internal bleeding in time. He's alive because of you. We all did our part, Emma replied, brushing off the praise as she always did. But deep down, she knew her experience in combat had taught her to see what others often missed. It was a skill that had saved lives on the battlefield and now in Meadow Creek. The diner was calm at this hour. Red, the owner, was behind the counter, cleaning coffee mugs with his usual meticulous care. Vanessa, the young waitress who had recently left behind a chaotic life in the city, moved gracefully between tables, her smile warming the atmosphere. A few truckers sat in the corner, talking in low voices, while an elderly couple shared a piece of pie in a booth by the window. But the peace was shattered when the distant rumble of motorcycles reached the diner. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the floor as 6 bikes roared into the parking lot. The riders, clad in black leather vests emblazoned with a snarling wolf emblem, dismounted with the kind of swagger that spoke of practiced intimidation. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. Vanessa froze mid-step, the coffee pot trembling in her hands. Red straightened, his weathered face creasing with worry as he glanced toward the door. The elderly couple exchanged nervous glances, and even the truckers fell silent. Emma didn't turn, but she instinctively stiffened. Years of military training kicked in, her eyes flicking to the mirror behind the counter to assess the situation. 6 hostiles, 2 exits, 8 civilians, no immediate weapons visible. Her tactical mind was already working. The door swung open with a crash, and the bikers entered, filling the small space with their presence. The leader, a tall man with a salt and pepper beard and cold, calculating eyes, strolled in first. His vest bore the name Maverick, marking him as the president of the Iron Hounds. Behind him came Tank, a mountain of a man who looked like he could crush a chair with his bare hands, followed by Razor, Snake, Ghost, and Blade, names that were whispered in town with fear. Well, Maverick drawled, his voice carrying easily through the room. Looks like we found ourselves a nice, quiet spot. The bikers spread out, claiming territory as they moved. Tank knocked over a chair with a deliberate crash. making several patrons jump. Razor ran his fingers along the counter, knocking utensils to the floor with a smirk. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice shaking slightly. "Can I get you gentlemen something?" Maverick's cold smile didn't reach his eyes. "Sure, sweetheart. Why don't you tell me what a pretty girl like you is doing in a place like this?" Emma's hand tightened around her tea, but she remained still. Beside her, Rachel's breathing quickened, and Emma reached out to place a calming hand on her friend's arm. "Not yet," Emma whispered. Vanessa stammered a polite reply, stepping back from Maverick's predatory gaze. The elderly couple in the corner tried to quietly gather their things, but Ghost moved to block their path. "Leaving so soon?" he asked softly, his tone more menacing than loud. The tension was palpable, like a coiled spring ready to snap. And then Emma spoke, her voice calm and steady. "Leave them alone." All eyes turned to her. She hadn't moved from her seat, but the quiet authority in her words cut through the tension like a blade. Maverick turned, his cold eyes narrowing as he sized her up. "What was that?" "Sweetheart." Emma turned slowly, meeting his gaze with unflinching confidence. "I said leave them alone. They're just trying to enjoy their meal." For a moment, Maverick seemed caught off guard, but he quickly recovered, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "Looks like we've got ourselves a brave one. Boys." Tank cracked his knuckles, stepping forward, but Maverick held up a hand. He leaned against the counter next to Emma, his tone dropping to a dangerous growl. "You know what happens to people who don't mind their own business in this town?" Emma's lips curved into a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Do you know what happens to people who mistake kindness for weakness?" The diner fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Rachel's hand moved to her phone, but Emma shook her head slightly. "Not yet. This wasn't about force. Not yet. This was about drawing a line in the sand, showing the Iron Hounds that their reign of fear stopped here." Maverick's eyes narrowed as Emma's words hung in the air, a quiet but undeniable challenge. He leaned in closer, trying to read her expression. But there was no fear, no hesitation. That unnerved him more than anything. Behind him, his men exchanged glances. This wasn't the reaction they were used to. "Kindness for weakness." "Huh," Maverick said, his tone dripping with mockery. "You think you're clever, don't you? I think you're disturbing a peaceful meal." Emma replied evenly, taking another sip of her tea. Her movements were calm, deliberate. "And I think you should leave before you make a bigger mistake." Maverick let out a low laugh, though it lacked real humor. "You've got guts. I'll give you that." He straightened, waving a hand at Tank. "Let's see if she's got anything else." Tank stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over Emma as he cracked his knuckles. The other patrons shrank back, and Rachel reached for Emma's arm, whispering, "Emma, don't." Emma stood, her movements smooth and deliberate. She was dwarfed by Tank's sheer size, but she didn't show the slightest sign of intimidation. Instead, she locked eyes with him, her voice calm but firm. "I'm giving you a choice," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You can walk out that door now and leave these people in peace. Or you can stay, and we'll see exactly how much trouble you're looking for." Tank sneered, clearly unbothered by her warning. "You think you can handle me, little girl?" Emma didn't flinch. "I've handled worse." The confidence in her voice sent a ripple through the room. Even Maverick hesitated, studying Emma with new interest. "Worse? Her," he said, stepping closer. "Let me guess. You're some kind of tough girl? A cop? Military? Maybe. Combat medic?" Emma said simply. 3 tours in Iraq. Specialized in tactical casualty care. Her gaze flicked to Maverick's hands and the way he stood. "And I've dealt with men like you before." Maverick's grin faltered for the first time, but he quickly masked it. "Well, isn't that impressive?" he said, his tone still mocking but less certain. He glanced at Tank. Show her what happens when someone runs their mouth. Tank lunged, his hand shooting out to grab Emma. But she was already moving. Years of training kicked in, and her body reacted with precision. She sidestepped his reach, grabbing his wrist and twisting it at just the right angle. Tank let out a startled grunt as his knees buckled under the pain. The room froze. Even the other bikers seemed caught off guard as Tank fell to the floor, clutching his wrist. Emma stepped back, her posture relaxed but ready, her gaze flicking to the others. "Still want to try?" she asked, her voice steady. "Or have you figured out this isn't going to go the way you think?" For a moment, no one moved. Then Razor stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. "You think you're tough because you got lucky," he snarled. "There's 6 of us and 1 of you." Emma didn't waver. "Numbers don't mean much when you don't know what you're doing," she said. "And from what I've seen, you don't." Razor's face darkened, but Maverick held up a hand, stopping him. "Enough," he said, his voice cold. He turned back to Emma, his expression unreadable. "You think this is over? I think you need to leave," Emma said, her tone unwavering. "Now." For a long moment, Maverick didn't move. Then, with a sharp gesture, he motioned to his men. "Let's go," he said, his voice low. "We'll deal with this later." The bikers filed out reluctantly, their footsteps heavy with frustration. Maverick was the last to leave, pausing at the door to look back at Emma. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. Emma didn't respond. She stood her ground, watching as the roar of motorcycles faded into the night. The diner slowly came back to life, the tension dissipating like a lifted storm cloud. Red let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and Vanessa set the coffee pot down with shaking hands. Rachel turned to Emma, her voice a mix of awe and fear. "Do you think they'll come back?" Emma glanced at the door, her expression unreadable. "Probably," she admitted. "But if they do, we'll be ready." The other patrons began to murmur among themselves, gratitude and admiration evident in their faces. Red approached Emma, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here," he said. "Thank you." Emma gave him a small, reassuring smile. "They're bullies," she said simply. "And bullies only have power if you let them. Tonight, we didn't." But as she sat back down to finish her tea, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The Iron Hounds weren't the kind of men to let a challenge go unanswered. And when they came back, it wouldn't just be about intimidation, it would be about revenge. The following days in Meadow Creek carried a strange, tense energy. The confrontation at Red's Diner had already become the talk of the town. In a place as small as Meadow Creek, news traveled fast, and soon, everyone seemed to know about Emma Blake standing up to the Iron Hounds. At St. Mary's Hospital, Emma tried to go about her work as usual. But it wasn't easy. Colleagues approached her in hushed voices, half in awe and half in concern. "Emma," Rachel said one afternoon as they walked out of the trauma unit together. "People are talking. They're saying the Hounds are planning something." Emma didn't stop. "Of course they are," she said, her voice calm. "Men like Maverick don't back down easily." Rachel grabbed her arm, forcing her to stop. "That doesn't mean you have to face them alone." Emma looked at her friend, the concern in Rachel's blue eyes clear. "I'm not alone," Emma said quietly. "Not if the town stands together." Rachel let out a frustrated sigh. "Not everyone is as brave as you." Emma didn't respond immediately. She knew Rachel was right. Fear had been a part of Meadow Creek for years, a shadow cast by gangs like the Iron Hounds. People had learned to keep their heads down, to avoid trouble. But Emma had spent too much of her life in war zones to believe that silence could protect anyone. If no one stood up, the fear would never end. That evening, Emma returned to Red's Diner. It felt quieter than usual, as if the tension from that night still lingered in the air. Red greeted her with a small smile, but there was worry behind his eyes. They've been driving by, he said in a low voice as Emma took her usual seat at the counter. Different ones. Not just the guys from the other night. Watching. Emma nodded. They're trying to scare us. And it's working. Red admitted. His voice shaking slightly. A lot of people aren't coming in anymore. Emma looked around. The usual crowd of truckers and night shift workers was noticeably absent. Even Vanessa seemed subdued as she moved between tables. Her eyes flicking nervously to the windows every few minutes. They want you to feel alone, Emma said. Her voice steady. That's how they keep their power. Before Red could reply, the bell over the door jingled. Everyone in the diner tensed as 3 men walked in. Their leather vests unmistakable. These weren't the same men from before, but the snarling wolf emblem on their backs marked them as iron hounds. They didn't say a word as they took seats at a booth. Their presence a silent challenge. Emma didn't react immediately, but she felt the shift in the room. Vanessa's steps faltered, and Red's hand tightened around the coffee pot. Emma turned slightly, just enough to see the men out of the corner of her eye. They were watching her. Their expressions unreadable. After a moment, she stood and walked over to their table. The diner fell silent. All eyes on her. The bikers didn't flinch as she approached. But one of them, a man with a scar running down his cheek, smirked. You got something to say, lady? He asked. His voice low and mocking. Yes, Emma said. Her tone calm but firm. You're not welcome here. The man's smirk widened. And who's gonna make us leave? You. Emma met his gaze without blinking. If I have to. The tension in the room was suffocating. For a moment. No one moved. Then the man with the scar leaned back in his seat. His smirk fading. You've got guts, he said grudgingly. But guts only get you so far. Maybe. Emma replied. Her voice steady. But fear doesn't get you anywhere. The men exchanged glances. Something unspoken passing between them. Then, without a word, they stood and walked out. The bell over the door jingling again as it closed behind them. The diner remained silent for a long moment before Red let out a shaky breath. You think that's it? Emma shook her head. No, she said simply. That was just a message. The real fight's still coming. That night, Emma sat in her small apartment, staring out the window. The streets of Meadow Creek were quiet. But she knew it wouldn't last. The Iron Hounds were regrouping. And when they came back, it wouldn't be for idle threats. She thought about her time in Iraq. The battles fought not just with weapons but with willpower, strategy, and trust. She'd faced worse than the Iron Hounds before. But this time, it wasn't just her life on the line. It was her community's. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. She wasn't afraid. She couldn't afford to be. Fear was the enemy here. And if she wanted to win, she had to show Meadow Creek that standing together was stronger than any gang. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow, I'll start preparing. The next morning, Emma woke early, her resolve steeled by the events of the previous night. The Iron Hounds weren't just trying to intimidate her, they were targeting the heart of Meadow Creek. She knew that if the town caved under the pressure, it would only embolden the gang further. But if they stood together, if they could show strength in unity, there might be a chance to turn the tide. Her first stop was St. Mary's Hospital. As she walked through the doors, she was greeted by Rachel, who looked more anxious than ever. They came by the hospital last night, Rachel said in a hushed voice as they walked down the corridor. A couple of them, sitting in the parking lot, didn't do anything, just sat there watching. They're testing us, Emma replied calmly, seeing who breaks first. Rachel stopped and grabbed Emma's arm. What if they hurt someone? Emma, they've done it before. You know what they're capable of. Emma met Rachel's gaze, her own steady and resolute. That's why we can't let them win, she said. If we give in to fear now, they'll own this town forever. Rachel hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. What's the plan? Emma exhaled slowly. We start with the people who need us the most. If they see we're not backing down, it might be enough to inspire others. Later that day, Emma began making her rounds. She stopped at small businesses, visiting shop owners who had grown used to living under the shadow of the iron hounds. Most of them were hesitant, their eyes darting nervously to the windows as they spoke. But Emma's presence seemed to give them some measure of comfort. At Joe's Hardware, the elderly owner, Mr. Abernathy, looked at her with weary eyes. "They've been coming around again," he admitted. "Told me if I don't pay up this month, they'll start breaking things. I can't afford that." "Emma, you shouldn't have to," Emma said firmly. "They want you to think you're alone, Mr. Abernathy. But you're not. If we stand together, they'll lose their power." The old man shook his head. "That's easier said than done." "Maybe," Emma said. "But if we don't try, they'll never stop." Her words planted a small seed of hope in Mr. Abernathy, and by the time she left, he was nodding, a glimmer of determination in his eyes. Her next stop was the diner. Red was busy fixing a broken window, a reminder of the biker's earlier visits. Vanessa was there too, but her usual bright smile was absent. Instead, she moved quickly and quietly, her eyes constantly scanning the room. "They're watching again," Vanessa murmured when Emma approached the counter. "I saw two of them parked across the street this morning." Emma glanced out the window. Sure enough, a black motorcycle was parked near the corner, its rider leaning casually against it as if he had all the time in the world. "They're waiting for us to slip up," Emma said. "But we're not going to give them the satisfaction." Vanessa looked doubtful. "What if they do more than just watch? Then we show them we're not afraid," Emma replied. Together. By the time the sun set, Emma had visited half a dozen places, speaking to store owners, waitresses, and truckers. She knew she couldn't force anyone to take a stand, but she could offer them something they hadn't had in years: hope. That evening, she returned home to find a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was rough, the message short and ominous. "You're playing a dangerous game, nurse. Back off before someone gets hurt." Emma stared at the note for a long moment, her pulse steady. She folded it neatly and placed it on the counter. Threats like this didn't scare her. They only made her more determined. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was Rachel. "Emma, you need to see this," Rachel said, her voice shaky. "What is it?" "They hit Charlie's bar," Rachel said. "Smashed the windows. Roughed up the owner. It's all over town." Emma's jaw tightened. She had expected the Iron Hounds to escalate. But this was a bold move. They weren't just targeting her anymore, they were sending a message to the entire town. "Stay home tonight," Emma said firmly. "Don't go anywhere alone." "What are you going to do?" Rachel asked. "I'm going to remind them that Meadow Creek isn't theirs to take," Emma said. As she hung up, Emma felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. This wasn't just a fight for herself anymore. It was for every person in Meadow Creek who had spent years living in fear. And if the Iron Hounds thought they could scare her into backing down, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The attack on Charlie's bar sent shockwaves through Meadow Creek. For years, the Iron Hounds had operated in the shadows, their intimidation subtle enough to avoid widespread backlash. But smashing windows and assaulting a well-known business owner was different. It was brazen, public, a clear signal that they were willing to escalate. Emma spent the next morning at St. Mary's, splitting her time between treating patients and checking in with Rachel and the other staff. There was a buzz of unease in the air, a quiet tension that everyone could feel but no one dared to voice. Around noon, Sheriff Logan Barnes stopped by the hospital. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of years of service. He was a familiar and reassuring presence in town. But today, his expression was grim. "Emma," he said as she exited the break room, "we need to talk." They stepped outside to the small courtyard. where the midday sun cast long shadows across the pavement. "I've been hearing things," Logan began, his voice low. "The hounds are regrouping. Mavericks called in reinforcements from neighboring chapters." Emma crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "I figured as much. This isn't just about you anymore," Logan continued. "They're trying to make an example out of Meadow Creek. If they crush the resistance here, it'll send a message to every other town they control. Then we can't let them win," Emma said simply. Logan frowned. "Emma, I appreciate what you're trying to do. But these aren't just local thugs. They're organized. Dangerous. If they come at you with everything they've got." "I've faced worse," Emma interrupted, her voice steady. "And I'm not doing this alone. The people here are stronger than they realize. They just need to see that." Logan hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I've got patrols watching the main roads and the hospital. If anything happens, we'll be ready." "Good," Emma said. "Because it's not a matter of if they're going to escalate." That evening, Emma returned to Red's diner. The place was quieter than usual, but there was a determined energy among the staff and patrons who had chosen to stay. Red greeted her with a nod as she took her usual seat at the counter. "Word's spreading," he said. "People are talking about standing up. About not letting the hounds run this town anymore." "That's the first step," Emma said, accepting the cup of tea Vanessa placed in front of her. "Fear only works when people feel isolated. If we come together, they lose their power." As the evening wore on, more people trickled in, locals who had heard about the attack on Charlie's bar and wanted to show their support. Emma recognized many of them, truckers who frequented the diner, nurses from the hospital, and even a few small business owners like Mr. Abernathy. By the time the sun had set, the diner was almost full. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, a stark contrast to the fear that had gripped Meadow Creek for so long. It was just past 8 when the familiar rumble of motorcycles shattered the fragile calm. The sound grew louder, filling the air with an unmistakable threat. Conversation in the diner fell silent as everyone turned toward the windows. Emma stood slowly, her heart steady. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The motorcycles came to a stop just outside, their riders dismounting with deliberate slowness. There were more of them this time, at least a dozen, their leather vests gleaming under the streetlights. Maverick was at the front, his salt and pepper beard and cold eyes as intimidating as ever. The door swung open, and Maverick stepped inside, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. Behind him, Tank and Razor flanked the entrance, their presence a silent warning. Well, Maverick drawled, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Looks like we've got ourselves a gathering." Emma stepped forward, placing herself between Maverick and the rest of the diner. "What do you want?" Maverick smirked, his eyes scanning the room. "I just came to remind everyone who runs this town. You don't run anything," Emma said firmly. "Not anymore." Maverick's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "You've got a lot of nerve, Blake. But nerve doesn't mean much when you're outnumbered." Emma didn't flinch. Numbers don't matter when people stand together. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Then, one by one, the patrons began to rise from their seats. Red stepped out from behind the counter. Vanessa moved to stand beside Emma, and even the truckers joined them. Maverick's smirk disappeared entirely as he realized what was happening. The crowd wasn't backing down. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled. Emma took a step closer, her voice calm but unyielding. "It already has." Maverick stared at her for a long moment, his fists clenching at his sides. Then he turned sharply, motioning for his men to follow. "This isn't over," he said over his shoulder, as the bikers filed out and the roar of their motorcycles faded into the distance. The diner erupted into quiet applause. Emma turned to face the crowd, her expression serious but hopeful. "They'll come back," she said. "But next time, We'll be ready. The next day, Meadow Creek felt different. Word of the standoff at Red's Diner had spread quickly, and for the first time in years, the people of the town weren't talking about what the Iron Hounds might do. They were talking about what they could do. The fear that had kept so many silent for so long was beginning to erode, replaced by something stronger, hope. Emma woke early, her mind already focused on the steps they needed to take. If the Iron Hounds were regrouping, Meadow Creek needed to do the same. She couldn't fight this battle alone. Nor did she intend to. The previous night had proven that people were ready to stand together, they just needed direction. Her first stop was Sheriff Logan Barnes' office. The small police station was buzzing with activity, a reflection of the growing tension in town. Logan was at his desk, speaking into the phone when Emma arrived. He gestured for her to sit as he finished his call. More reports, Logan said as he hung up. Vandalism. Intimidation. They're trying to rattle us. They're trying to scare us into submission. Emma corrected. It's not working. Logan leaned back in his chair, studying her. What's the plan? Emma. We need to organize. Emma said firmly. The people in this town are ready to fight back. But they need to know they're not alone. We need to show them how. Logan raised an eyebrow. And how do you suggest we do that? Emma hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. I've seen this kind of fight before overseas. In war zones. It's not just about strength. It's about strategy. If we're going to take a stand, we need to be smart about it. Logan nodded slowly. All right. What do you need? Start by increasing patrols in the most vulnerable areas. Emma said. The hospital. The schools. Small businesses like Joe's Hardware. Let people see a police presence. It'll help them feel safer. And the diner? Logan asked. Emma's jaw tightened. The diner's the symbol now. That's where we make our stand. Later that day, Emma returned to Red's Diner to find a small group of people waiting for her. Vanessa was there, along with Red, Rachel, and a handful of other locals who had decided enough was enough. They looked at Emma expectantly, their determination tempered by uncertainty. We need to be ready for whatever comes next. Emma began, addressing the group. The Iron Hounds won't back down easily. But neither will we. They're counting on fear to keep us divided. If we stand together, we can stop them. Rachel stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. What do you need us to do? Emma smiled faintly, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. We start by protecting each other. If you see something suspicious, report it immediately. Don't confront them alone. We're stronger as a group. Vanessa raised her hand hesitantly. What if they come back here? Last night felt like a warning. It was. Emma agreed. But we sent our own message. We're not afraid. And if they come back, we'll be ready. The group spent the afternoon preparing. Red installed security cameras around the diner, while Rachel and Vanessa worked on organizing a phone tree to keep the community informed. Emma trained a few volunteers in basic self-defense techniques, drawing on her combat medic experience to teach them how to stay calm under pressure. As the sun began to set, Emma felt a sense of cautious optimism. The town was starting to come together, and for the first time, she could see the possibility of real change. But she also knew the Iron Hounds wouldn't give up without a fight. That night, Emma sat by the window of her small apartment, watching the quiet streets of Meadow Creek. Her mind drifted to her time in Iraq, to the countless nights she had spent in tense anticipation of the next attack. This felt different. But the stakes were just as high. This wasn't just about survival, it was about taking back a community. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing. It was a text from Rachel. They're on the move. Logan just called. They think the Hounds are planning something big. Emma's pulse quickened. But she forced herself to stay calm. This was what she had been preparing for. The real fight was coming. And she knew it would test everything she and Meadow Creek had built. She texted back, "I'll meet you at the diner. Let's get everyone ready." Emma grabbed her jacket and headed out into the night. The battle for Meadow Creek was far from over. But as she walked toward Red's diner, she felt a quiet confidence. The Iron Hounds had underestimated her once. They wouldn't get the chance to do it again. The air outside Red's diner was electric with anticipation. A small but determined group of Meadow Creek residents had gathered, their faces set with resolve. Emma stood at the center, scanning the crowd as Rachel and Logan joined her. The text about the Iron Hounds' movements had spread quickly, and everyone knew tonight could mark a turning point. Logan stepped forward, addressing the group. "We've received reports that Maverick is planning something big tonight. They've been gathering riders from neighboring towns. This isn't just about us anymore, it's about showing everyone what happens when a community refuses to back down." Red, standing near the diner's front door, tightened his grip on the baseball bat he'd been keeping behind the counter. "Whatever happens, this is our home," he said firmly. "We're not going to let them take it." Emma stepped forward, her voice calm but commanding. "Logan's right. They're trying to send a message. But so are we. Tonight, we show them that Meadow Creek isn't afraid. But remember, we're here to defend, not to provoke. Stay together. Watch each other's backs. And whatever happens, don't let them intimidate you." Rachel looked at Emma, her eyes filled with both admiration and worry. "Are we really ready for this?" Emma gave her a small smile. "We're as ready as we need to be." The rumble of motorcycles in the distance cut through the night, growing louder with each passing second. The sound was a reminder of what they were up against, not just the Iron Hounds' physical presence but the years of fear they had instilled in the community. Emma turned toward the sound, her heart steady. "Here they come." The first wave of bikes roared into the parking lot, their riders dismounting with deliberate slowness. Maverick was at the head of the group, flanked by Tank, Razor, and a dozen other Iron Hounds. Their leather vests gleamed under the streetlights, the snarling wolf emblem on their backs a stark contrast to the calm determination of the crowd. Well, Maverick said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like the whole town's come out to play." Emma stepped forward, her posture relaxed but unyielding. "We're done playing. Maverick. You've pushed this town around long enough." Maverick's eyes narrowed as he studied her. "You've got guts, Blake. I'll give you that. But guts won't save you when the numbers are on our side." Emma's gaze swept over the bikers, her expression unreadable. "Numbers don't mean much when you don't know what you're up against." Maverick chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "And what exactly are we up against?" "You. A nurse with a big mouth." Emma's lips twitched in a faint smile. "A nurse who knows how to fight. A sheriff who won't back down. A town that's tired of being afraid. You're not just up against me, Maverick. You're up against all of us." The crowd behind her stirred, emboldened by her words. Red stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Emma, his baseball bat resting against his leg. Vanessa joined him, her small frame radiating quiet defiance. One by one, others moved forward until Emma was no longer standing alone. Maverick's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He glanced at Tank, who cracked his knuckles and took a step forward. Emma didn't move, her voice cutting through the tension. "Think carefully, Tank. You're big. But size doesn't protect you when you don't know your weaknesses." Tank hesitated, his gaze flicking to Maverick. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, the confidence they had arrived with beginning to waver. Maverick's voice hardened. "You think a bunch of townsfolk can take on the Iron Hounds? You're out of your depth, Blake." Emma's eyes locked on his. "Am I? Because it looks to me like you're the one who's outnumbered." As if on cue, Logan's patrol cars pulled into the lot, their lights flashing. Officers stepped out, their presence adding weight to the already tense standoff. Logan walked toward the group, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. This ends tonight. Logan said firmly. Take your crew and leave. Maverick. Or you'll be leaving in cuffs. Maverick glanced between Logan and Emma, his jaw tightening. For the first time, he seemed to realize just how much the balance of power had shifted. The crowd, the police, and Emma's unshakable resolve had turned the odds against him. This isn't over. Maverick snarled, his voice laced with anger. Emma's voice was calm but unyielding. You're right. It's not. But you're done here. Take your men and go. Maverick's glare lingered on her for a long moment before he turned sharply. Let's go, he barked at his crew. The bikers hesitated, their pride warring with their instincts. But one by one, they climbed back onto their bikes. The roar of engines filled the air as they pulled out of the lot. Their departure marked not by victory but by retreat. As the sound of motorcycles faded, the crowd let out a collective breath. The battle wasn't over. But tonight, Meadow Creek had won a small but important victory. Emma turned to face the crowd, her voice steady and clear. This is what happens when we stand together, she said. We're stronger than they ever gave us credit for. And this town, our town, is worth fighting for. The crowd erupted into applause, their fear replaced by a growing sense of hope. Emma allowed herself a small smile. The Iron Hounds might come back. But so would Meadow Creek's resolve. Together, they would be ready for whatever came next. The quiet of Meadow Creek streets the next morning felt almost surreal. The Iron Hounds had left for now, but their departure hadn't erased the tension that hung in the air. Emma knew their retreat wasn't a surrender, just a pause in a battle far from over. If anything, Maverick's parting words, "This isn't over," echoed in her mind as both a threat and a promise. At Red's diner, the crowd from the night before was smaller but still present. People were nursing cups of coffee and quiet conversations, their resolve intact but tempered by the reality of what they were up against. Red stood behind the counter, a rare look of optimism on his face as he cleaned a row of mugs. Vanessa approached Emma, sliding a steaming cup of tea in front of her. They'll be back, won't they? She asked, her voice soft but steady. Emma nodded, taking a sip of the tea. Yes. But so will we. Vanessa hesitated, then leaned in slightly. I don't know how you do it, Emma. How you stay so calm. Aren't you scared? Emma looked at her, her expression thoughtful. Of course I'm scared, she admitted. Fear isn't something you can get rid of, it's something you learn to live with. The trick is not letting it control you. That's something I learned in Iraq. Fear kept us alive. But if you let it paralyze you, it becomes a weapon against you. Vanessa nodded slowly, taking in Emma's words. I guess we're all learning that now. As the morning wore on, Sheriff Logan Barnes entered the diner, his uniform freshly pressed but his face showing signs of a sleepless night. He walked straight to Emma's table and sat down across from her. Got word from one of my deputies, Logan said. Mavericks called a meeting of the neighboring chapters. They're regrouping. And it looks like they're planning something big. Emma set her cup down. How long do we have? Hard to say, Logan replied. But it won't be long. They're angry. And they want to make an example out of us. Emma leaned back in her chair, her mind already working through the possibilities. She glanced at the other patrons in the diner, faces that had grown familiar over the past few weeks. These were people who had spent years living in fear. And now they were fighting back, rediscovering their strength. She couldn't let the Iron Hounds take that away from them. We need to be ready, Emma said finally. Whatever they're planning, we can't let them catch us off guard. Logan nodded. What do you need? More patrols, Emma said. Especially around the diner and the hospital. And we need to keep the community informed. If people know what's coming, they can prepare. Logan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. You're really turning this town into an army, aren't you? Emma allowed herself a small smile. Not an army. A community. There's a difference. Later that afternoon, Emma gathered the core group of volunteers at the diner. Red, Vanessa, Rachel, and a few others listened intently as she outlined their next steps. "We've already shown them we won't back down," Emma began. "Now we need to make sure we're ready for whatever they throw at us. That means sticking together, staying alert, and supporting each other." Rachel raised her hand. "What about the people who are still too scared to step up?" "They'll come around," Emma said. "We're not here to pressure anyone. We're here to show them that standing together works. And when they're ready, they'll join us." The group spent the rest of the day preparing. Red's Diner became a makeshift command center, with maps spread across tables and lists of contact numbers pinned to the walls. Volunteers took turns patrolling the streets, while others focused on supporting local businesses and families who had been targeted by the Iron Hounds. By the time the sun set, Meadow Creek felt different. The fear was still there, but it no longer felt insurmountable. For the first time in years, the town was fighting back, not with weapons or violence, but with unity and determination. That night, Emma sat by her window, watching the streetlights cast long shadows across the quiet road. Her mind drifted to her time in the military, to the camaraderie and resilience that had carried her through the darkest moments. She thought about the people of Meadow Creek, about their courage and their willingness to stand together despite the odds. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Logan. "Intel says they're moving tomorrow night. Be ready." Emma stared at the message for a long moment, her jaw tightening. She stood, grabbing her jacket and heading out the door. The battle for Meadow Creek was about to reach its climax, and she intended to meet it head-on. As she walked toward Red's Diner, Emma felt a quiet resolve settle over her. This wasn't just about standing up to the Iron Hounds, it was about proving that fear didn't have to rule their lives. Meadow Creek was worth fighting for, and she wasn't going to let anything take it away. Tomorrow night, she thought. Tomorrow, we end this. In the end, Meadow Creek stood united, stronger than ever. The Iron Hounds' attempt to reclaim control failed, not because of one person's strength, but because of the community's courage. Led by Emma Blake, they proved that fear only holds power when people allow it. Through their resilience and unity, the town reclaimed its peace, turning Red's Diner into a symbol of hope and defiance. Emma, once a quiet nurse with a past as a combat medic, became a beacon of inspiration, not a hero in the traditional sense, but a reminder that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they stood together. As the sun set over Meadow Creek, the streets buzzed with life, free from the shadow of intimidation. This story reminds us all, bravery and unity can change everything. Subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales of resilience and triumph.